Okay, so today's video is going to be about the structure of plants. So let's start with some of the basics. If y'all remember from kingdoms, plants can go all the way up to having systems. So plants have cells, they have tissues, they have organs, and they even have organ systems. So plants are highly organized structures, highly organized living things. They do a wide variety of functions. So let's do a little bit of review here with the plant cells. So first of all, remember plant cells are eukaryotic. So remember eukaryotic, they've got membrane-bound organelles. And so you can see that there's mitochondria in the plant cell. Remember it does photosynthesis, but it still needs to take that food that it made in photosynthesis and convert it into useful ATP. It's got chloroplast, nucleus, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi body, all those membrane-bound organelles. Remember, plant and animal cells had some differences. Remember, compared to an animal cell, plant cells have a cell wall. And remember that wall is made of cellulose. Okay? Plant cells also had that large central vacuole that held the water, that helped make the plants stand upright when it's full of water. Remember the turgor pressure? When a plant that is full of water in a hypotonic solution, remember it won't swell and burst because it has a cell wall, but that water will fill that central vacuole and increase the pressure inside the plant cell. And so the plant will look turgid. And remember there were other plants that could look flaccid or wilty based upon how much water was in that central vacuole. Okay. Plants also have a chloroplast that animal cells do not have, because we do not do photosynthesis, so we do not need to have chloroplasts inside of our cells. Okay, so plants have two basic systems. They have the root system and the shoot system. And basically, you've got an above-ground system and an underground system. So let's start first with the root system. Okay, so root system, some of the jobs of the root system would be to absorb, in particular, water and nutrients from the ground. Okay, so the roots contain what are called root hairs. Okay, that'll help increase the surface area so that it can absorb even more water and nutrients from the ground. For instance, if this was a root here, on that root would be a whole bunch of extra little folds that will increase the surface area of that root. And those little folds are the root hairs. And so that helps it increase, take in more water as well as take in more nutrients. You also have some plants that will have a relationship with fungus. They'll form what's called a mycorrhizae, okay, which is a mutualistic relationship between the plant and the fungus. And so the fungus, remember fungus is a heterotroph, so the fungus will get food from the plant. In addition to, and the benefit to the plant is that the fungus will help increase the surface area of the roots of the plant to help it absorb more water and minerals. The main minerals and nutrients that the plant will absorb from the ground are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And these all have key roles in a plant. If you think back to our organic compounds, remember carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, nitrogen and phosphorus. Nitrogen is found in both proteins and nucleic acids. So you need nitrogen to build more DNA, to build RNA. Remember those nitrogen bases that were in there. You need nitrogen in proteins, in the amino acids. They contain nitrogen. Remember that NCC pattern. Okay. Phosphorus as well is in the nucleotide. Remember sugar, phosphate, nitrogen base. Okay. Potassium plays an important role, we'll talk about in just a minute, with water regulation in the plant. So all of these are very important. These are what you see on fertilizer bags. When you see a fertilizer bag that has a number like this, it's telling you how much nitrogen is in there, how much phosphate is in there, as well as how much potassium is in there. Okay, so that's what those numbers on the fertilizer bag are for. Okay, so some other functions of roots. So in addition to absorbing minerals and water, they will also help to act as an anchor for the plant. Okay, so they'll help hold the plant in place, as well as store energy for the plant. The excess food that the plant makes during photosynthesis, that it doesn't necessarily need to break down into ATP right that second, that excess food will be stored in the plant, usually down in the roots. We store excess food as fat. The plant will store the excess food down in its roots, like that's what potatoes are, carrots are. They're storing that extra food that was made during photosynthesis. So there are 4 basic types of roots that a plant could have. The first one is what's called fibrous. So these are the fibrous roots. You'll notice they're all about the same size. Okay, so that's what's characteristic of a fibrous root. They're all about the same size. These will really help increase surface area. They can spread out over very long distances to try to reach water. You'll notice grass is a fibrous root. A lot of plants that are grazed by animals will have fibrous roots so that they can have a large network of roots. So when the animal comes to eat the grass, it will bite the grass off right here, and the roots will still survive, so then they can just grow more grass because they're so anchored down into the ground. Okay, another kind would be the taproot. And so the taproot is essentially one large fat root with some other smaller roots that will come off of it. Usually that large fat root there is used for food storage. The example here is a dandelion. So it's, like I said, sweet potatoes, carrots. Those would all be examples of taproot systems. So these are mostly for food storage. You also have some that are called aerial roots. Okay, you can see these aerial roots here. Aerial roots are for plants that are called epiphytes. Epiphytes are plants that do not grow in the ground. They grow on other plants, but they are not a parasite. Okay? So they are not sucking the nutrients out of another plant. They're not stealing water. They are not stealing food from the other plant. Their roots just wrap around the plant. Basically, they're just anchored to the plant. So they do that with aerial roots. And then another kind of root that we could have is what's called a prop root. And you can see this prop root here. Prop roots are actually above ground, okay, and they do exactly what their name suggests. They help support the plant, and they're an above ground root. So next we have what's called the shoot system. Okay, and so the shoot system is everything that is above ground. Okay, so that's going to include your leaves, your flowers, your stems, cones, anything that's above ground. And the shoot system is going to offer support. Okay, it's going to offer support to the entire plant. Parts of the stem would offer support to the leaves so that they can be exposed to the sunlight. You've got the stem that will support the flowers so that they can be easily accessible for pollination. Okay, so you can see the support that the stem would offer. It also is for food production. Okay, so the shoot system is where food is going to be produced, in particular in the leaves, doing photosynthesis. Okay, so let's start first with the leaves and the structure of the leaves. So first we have what's called the blade. Okay, and so the blade is the broad, large, flat portion of the leaf. This is where the majority of this is where photosynthesis would take place. This is really what we consider the leaf. Okay, so that would be the blade. Then you have what's called the leaf stem. Okay, so that's like this guy there. Okay. It's called the petiole. So you can see there's one. There's the leaf stem. Okay, so that's just going to offer support to the leaf. And then you have what are called the veins in the leaf. You can see them running there, and pretty big one coming up through there. Okay, those are called veins, just like in your body, and they are part of the vascular tissue. They're going to help transport water throughout the plant. They're going to transport the extra food throughout the plant, and we'll talk a little bit more about the vascular system in a few minutes. But you have the leaves will have veins in them for transport. Also on the leaf, on the underside of the leaf, you'll find what's called the stomata. Okay, if you remember when we did photosynthesis, we talked about the stomata. Okay, the stomata is where water loss occurs. So water is lost from the plant through the stomata. Water's absorbed down in the roots, travels up the plant, and then is lost out through the leaves, through the stomata. And we'll talk about transpiration, how it's able to go up like a big giant tree, and how the water's able to do that in a future video. So the stomata is where the water is lost, as well as where gas exchange takes place. Remember, plants need to take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen. And so they're going to do that gas exchange through the stomata, through those little holes underneath on the bottom of the leaf. And we're going to hopefully be doing a lab soon where you're going to be able to see those stomata on the bottom of the leaf. So let's talk a little bit more about those stomata. So remember, the stomata is the actual hole in the leaf, on the bottom of the leaf, that pore. Okay, and the stomata is surrounded by what are called guard cells. And so, like I said, the stomata is the actual space. It's the hole. It's not really a thing. It's an opening, it's air, it's a space. And so it's surrounded by these guard cells. And so the guard cells control whether that stomata is open or closed. So remember, the stomata is where water is lost through transpiration. So water is pulled out of the leaf through the stomata. But again, it's also where gas exchange takes place. So the plant has to be able to balance whether that stomata is going to be opened or closed. Okay? If it's closed, it's conserving water. So if it's really hot and it's really dry, it's conserving water, and water isn't leaving the plant. But if it's closed, it cannot do photosynthesis because it's not getting the gas exchange is not happening. And so the plant is unable to do photosynthesis. And so the plant has to balance out being able to get enough gas to do photosynthesis, as well as getting keeping enough water inside of the plant so that it can still function. So the guard cells regulate whether this is open or closed, okay, and they're going to do that by water. Remember that turgor pressure and whether the cell is flaccid. So if the guard cell here is open, that means it's turgid. Okay, it has a very high turgor pressure. Okay, what happens is when there's plenty of water available, potassium, remember K is potassium. Okay, so potassium will go into the cell. And if y'all remember from when we talked about water movement and hypertonic, hypotonic, isotonic, remember water flows from high to low. Well, if you have a substance, a solute, like potassium, going into the cell, then water is also going to go into the cell. It will follow that potassium into the cell. When a plant cell becomes full of water, it becomes very turgid, like a big swollen balloon. And these guard cells are shaped with this kind of kidney bean shape. So as they become turgid and swollen, they push against one another here, and it opens up a space. It opens up the stomata. When there's not enough water available, potassium will leave the cell, and so water will follow that potassium. Now the cell becomes flaccid, and they collapse down, closing the stomata, and there is no opening there. Okay, so then again, you wouldn't be able to do photosynthesis as well with it closed, because you wouldn't be able to bring in the carbon dioxide that the plant needed to do photosynthesis. Leaves also have this waxy coating on them called the cuticle. Okay, and it's a waxy coating, so it's a lipid-based coating. And remember, from our organic compounds, lipids or fats, as most of you all just know. Remember, they don't mix very well with water. So this is a waxy coating on the top of the leaf. And you can see it makes the leaf, you can see the water beating up here on the leaf. It makes the leaf essentially waterproof. Think about those plants, those desert plants, like aloe and those succulents that you see in the store. Those have a very, very thick cuticle on them because this cuticle helps to decrease water loss, which would be very important for a desert plant, plant in a very hot, dry climate that could potentially lose so much water that it dies. Okay, so plants also have reproductive organs on them. Plants can reproduce sexually and asexually. Some plants that reproduce sexually produce flowers. Okay, so I've got a flower here, and we're going to kind of review some parts of the flower. Hopefully that's a review for you guys. Okay, so let's talk about what kind of plants have flowers on them. First of all, these plants are what are called angiosperms. Okay, so angiosperms are flowering plants. Okay, and your main basic parts of the flower that you guys need to be comfortable with would be the stamen here, which includes the anther and the filament. The anther is what makes pollen. Okay, pollen is essentially plant sperm. Okay, so that's the male portion of the plant. So the stamen, which is this whole thing here, and it's got the anther on the top that makes the pollen, which is sperm, and the filament, which holds the anther up high enough so when the bird or the insect comes over to feed from the plant, it will be able to touch the pollen because the pollen will be up high enough to come in contact with it. Okay, over on the other side, you have what's called the carpel, and the carpel is the female portion of the plant. So the carpel is the female portion of the plant. It consists of the stigma. The stigma is a sticky part that will trap the pollen. Okay, so this stalk here is called the stigma, is called the style, which is holding up the stigma, which again is sticky to trap the pollen. And then down at the very base would be the ovary. And the ovary is where you're going to find the egg. So when pollen is able to find its way to the stigma and stick there, it then has to travel down the length of the style down to the base to be able to find the egg down at the bottom of the flower. Okay, flowers also obviously have petals. Okay, the main job of the petals usually is to attract the pollinators. They're bright colors, easy to see, and that attracts the pollinators. And then down here you have what are called the sepals. And the sepals will help protect the flower bud. Okay, if you've ever seen a flower that hasn't bloomed yet, okay, and it's kind of wrapped in what looks like green leaves before it blooms, okay, those are the sepals that are protecting the budding, growing flower. So another major kind of plant is what's called a gymnosperm. So we had angiosperms that were flowering plants. Gymnosperm actually stands for naked seed. Okay, and so basically these are plants that do not produce flowers. Okay, they reproduce sexually. So the cone here, so gymnosperms produce cones, like a pine tree. Okay, and so they do produce pollen and eggs. There are two different kinds of pine cones. Like you'll see big fat pine cones like this, like kind of a typical pine cone. That's a female pine cone. And then sometimes you'll see kind of long, thin pine cones, and those are the male cones. So they contain pollen and ovules, and when they're fertilized, the seed is also contained on the cone. And so it's not protected and wrapped in a flower and potentially into a fruit like a lot of your angiosperms are. Okay, so the last thing we'd like to look at here with the plants is what's called the vascular tissue. Okay, and so vascular tissue, again, is a transport distribution system, just like in humans. Remember, we had our vascular system, cardiovascular system, with the heart and the vessels, the arteries and the veins. This is the same concept. We're distributing things all over the plant. Okay, and so there are two basic types. Okay, we've got xylem, which is this section here, all this kind of dark area here. You can see with the X. Okay, so that's the xylem. And so xylem transports water. That's a cross section that you're looking at there of a stem. Okay, so you can see over here, this here, okay, is a cross section of the stem. So xylem transports water. Okay, so xylem basically is going to move unilateral. It's going to go from down in the roots up to the rest of the plant. Okay, so up to the leaves through transpiration. Like I said, transpiration we'll talk about. It will have its own separate video. The other kind of vascular tissue is what's called phloem. Okay, and phloem is essentially for food transport. And so phloem, as a general rule, will flow down because it'll flow from the leaf down to the base of the plant. It flows from what we call, okay, so both of these are types of vascular tissue, and it flows, the liquid in the phloem will flow from what's called the source to the sink. Okay, they'll flow source to sink, which means if the plant is active and doing lots of photosynthesis, then the food will be flowing down from the leaves down to the roots to be stored. Okay, if for some reason it needs to use some of that food that has been stored down in the roots and it's not producing enough photosynthesis wise, then that now becomes the source, and it can flow up. And the sink would be the place that has less food available to it. Okay. All of the fluid that travels in both xylem and phloem is called sap. Okay, so there's basically a sugar sap in the phloem and more of a watery sap in the xylem. Okay, syrup is a kind of sap that we get, maple syrup. Okay, so sap is the fluid that will move up and down the tissues. A lot of animals will eat it. A lot of insects eat it. That's why they bore holes into the plant, is they're trying to get to the sap that's in there with the sugars in the food. So in addition to moving food and water throughout the plant, the vascular system will also move hormones throughout the plant. Okay, plants are a lot more complicated than a lot of us give them credit for. They do signal, the cells signal one another, the plant communicates with other portions of the plant is able to respond to a stimuli, it's able to respond to the outside environment, it's able to adjust things within its cells. Okay, but it will do this using hormones. If you remember, humans used nervous system and hormones. You know, all animals, they're going to use their nervous system and they will use these hormones. Well, plants don't have a nervous system, but they do have hormones. And so, like I said, those are also transported through the vascular tissue. And so, as a general rule, these hormones really are just going to, like they do for humans and for other animals, they are going to just control your response. Okay, so the hormones in the plant are going to control the plant's response to water, to light, to gravity, and we'll talk about those things. That's actually the next video we're going to watch. Some examples of hormones that a plant could have are things like auxin. Auxin is what makes the plant, like if you have house plants in your house and they're in a window and your mom kind of occasionally turns them because they're starting to bend towards the sun, that's due to the auxin production. You can see that happening here in this picture. The purple dots are your auxin hormone. Okay? And as the light exposure continues to be on one side of the plant here, that shifts where your auxin is, okay, and allows the plant to start leaning towards the light. So auxin, ethylene. Ethylene is the gas that's produced by plants that help them when it's time to ripen. You know, if you've got a mom or grandma when you're trying to, you've got maybe some fruit or something that's not as ripe as you would like it to be, and they put it in a brown bag and just leave it on the counter for a day or two. Well, what they're doing is they're trapping that ethylene gas so that fruit will ripen faster. Another one would be gibberellins. These also, like the auxin, can change the length of the cell, of the plant cell, and so they can have an impact on plant growth as well. And so, like I said, next video we'll be talking a lot more about how these hormones cause these responses and what kinds of responses the plant can have.